Imagine a king who never wanted to rule. A man born not for power, but for peace, quiet, books, and the gentle ticking of clockwork gears in his private workshop. Yet, destiny thrust him onto the most dangerous throne in Europe, at the edge of a revolution that would devour monarchs, priests, and aristocrats alike. His name? Louis XVI. And his story is not just one of crowns and guillotines, it's the tragic unraveling of a decent man caught in the storm of history's most violent transformation. This is not the tale of a tyrant, nor is it the legend of a hero. It is the haunting chronicle of hesitation in the face of crisis, of good intentions drowned by bad timing, and of a monarchy that collapsed not with a roar, but with the quiet click of a key turning in a prison door. By the time the people of France had had enough, Louis XVI wasn't just their king, he was their symbol of everything they hated and everything they once believed in. Born on August 23, 1754, in the golden halls of the Palace of Versailles, Louis Auguste de France entered a world of unbearable expectation. He was not the firstborn son meant for the crown. No, his elder brother, Louis, Duke of Burgundy, was the radiant hope of the Bourbon dynasty. Louis Auguste was the spare, shy, bookish, nearsighted, and deeply introverted. He preferred lock-making to politics, Latin to court gossip, and solitary walks through the manicured gardens to the glittering, suffocating soirees of Versailles. But fate is a cruel editor. In 1761, his older brother died, then his father, then his mother. By the age of 11, Louis Auguste was heir to a crumbling empire he barely understood. The France he inherited was a nation of contradictions. On the surface, it glittered. Versailles radiated with chandeliers, silks, and the perfume of power. But beneath that gilded crust, the country was rotting. Decades of war, especially France's ruinously expensive support of the American Revolution, had emptied the royal treasury. Taxes bled the peasantry dry, while the nobility and clergy paid almost nothing. Bread prices soared. Hunger spread like a plague through the countryside. And the Enlightenment was whispering dangerous new ideas into the ears of the people. Liberty, equality, the rights of man. The king, meanwhile, remained isolated, trapped in a bubble of protocol, surrounded by advisors who told him what he wanted to hear, not what he needed to know. When Louis XVI ascended the throne in 1774, at just 19 years old, he genuinely wanted to reform. He was not indifferent to suffering, he was simply paralyzed by it. He appointed progressive ministers like Turgot and Necker, men who dared to suggest that even the nobles should pay taxes. But when the aristocracy howled in protest, Louis folded. Again and again he retreated. He feared losing his authority more than he feared losing his people. And so, reform after reform collapsed under the weight of his indecision. By 1789, France was on fire. The Estates General, a medieval assembly revived out of desperation, quickly morphed into the National Assembly, as the Third Estate, commoners, declared they represented the true will of the nation. Louis watched, bewildered, as his authority evaporated. He tried to flee in 1791, the infamous flight to Varennes, disguised as a servant, hoping to rally royalist support from abroad. But he was recognized, captured, and dragged back to Paris like a criminal. The image of the king as father of the nation shattered forever. Now he was a traitor in the eyes of many. The monarchy limped on for another year, now a constitutional fiction, with Louis XVI reduced to a figurehead signing decrees he despised. But radicals like Robespierre and Danton demanded more. They wanted not reform, but rebirth. And rebirth, they believed, required blood. In 1792, the monarchy was formally abolished. Louis Capet, as he was now mockingly called, stripped of his royal name, was imprisoned with his family in the Temple, a grim fortress in the heart of Paris. The revolution he failed to understand had come for him at last. What follows is not just the story of a king's downfall. It is the autopsy of an entire system, of divine right, of aristocratic privilege, of a world where birth dictated destiny. And it is also the birth of modern politics, where power flows not from heaven, but from the people. Louis XVI did not die because he was evil. He died because he was obsolete. But his execution, on January 21, 1793, was not the end. It was the spark that ignited a continent. Kings trembled, empires mobilized, and France, once a kingdom, became something terrifyingly new. A republic willing to kill its own king to prove its ideals. So how did a man so ordinary become the face of a revolution so extraordinary? How did a failed monarch shape the modern world? And what secrets did he leave behind in his final letters, hidden in the lining of a book? Stay with us, because the real tragedy of Louis XVI isn't that he lost his head. It's that he never truly had a chance to keep it. They called her Madame Deficit. They said she danced while Paris starved. They claimed she once shrugged at the news of bread shortages and said, "Let them eat cake." Except she never said it. She never danced on graves. And yet, she still died for it. Marie Antoinette was not born to be hated. She was born to be a bridge, a living treaty between two empires, Austria and France, meant to end generations of bloodshed with a single wedding vow. At 14, she was handed a new name, a new language, a new god, and told to forget everything she had ever known. She crossed the Rhine in a golden carriage, her petticoats rustling like promises, her eyes wide with hope. But the France that welcomed her was not the France she would inherit, and the crown she dreamed of wearing would one day be replaced by the cold steel of a blade. This is not the story of a villain. This is the story of a girl who became a queen, and then a scapegoat, and finally a ghost in the machinery of revolution. Archduchess Maria Antonia Josepha Johanna of Austria was the 15th child of Empress Maria Theresa, ruler of the Habsburg dominions and one of the most formidable women in European history. For 7 long years, she lived in a kind of royal purgatory, married, but not truly a wife, queen in title, but not in influence. The unconsummated marriage, now infamous, wasn't just a personal humiliation, it was a political crisis. Without an heir, the Bourbon line teetered on extinction. Pamphlets circulated in Parisian alleyways depicting the king as impotent and the queen as a nymphomaniac seeking satisfaction elsewhere. The libelles, vile, pornographic tracts, painted her as a lesbian, an adulteress, even an incestuous monster. None of it was true. But truth mattered little when the people were hungry and needed someone to blame. Then, finally, in 1778, a miracle, a daughter, Marie-Thérèse Charlotte, and later a son, Louis-Joseph, the long-awaited Dauphin. Motherhood softened her. She withdrew from the excesses of court, built a private retreat at the Petit Trianon, and created a rustic fantasy world called the Hameau, a model farm where she played shepherdess in silk gowns. To her, it was innocent escapism. To the public, it was grotesque theater. How dare a queen pretend to be a peasant while real peasants sold their teeth to feed their children? Her spending was real, but not outrageous by royal standards. Louis XV's mistresses had bled the treasury far more. Yet Marie Antoinette had no protector, no public relations machine, and no understanding of optics. She bought diamonds she didn't need, the infamous affair of the diamond necklace, a scandal in which she was entirely innocent but publicly condemned. She hosted masked balls during famines, she wrote careless letters, and every misstep was magnified tenfold by a press newly liberated by Enlightenment ideals and newly weaponized by political rage. When the revolution erupted in 1789, she became its lightning rod. While Louis XVI hesitated, she acted, often recklessly. She urged him to resist the National Assembly. She secretly corresponded with foreign monarchs, begging for military intervention. She believed, as many royals did, that the mob would tire, that order would return, that God would protect His anointed. But the revolution had no patience for divine right. It answered only to the people, and the people had turned against her. The royal family's attempted escape in 1791, the flight to Varennes, was largely her idea. Disguised as a Russian baroness, she led her children through the night, convinced they could reach loyalist territory. But they were recognized, captured, and paraded back to Paris like captives. The image of the queen, pale, defiant, her wig slightly askew, staring out from a coach window as silent crowds watched, marked the end of monarchy's mystique. They were no longer gods among men. They were prisoners. Imprisoned in the temple, stripped of servants, titles, even privacy, Marie Antoinette transformed once more. Gone was the frivolous queen. In her place stood a woman of astonishing resilience. She taught her daughter Latin. She mended clothes with trembling hands. She shielded her son from interrogators who accused him of incest, forced confessions extracted under torture. When her beloved son died in 1789, likely of tuberculosis, she collapsed into grief so deep her jailers feared she would die before the tribunal could. But the revolution needed her trial, needed her death, not just to punish, but to prove that no one was above the Republic. Her trial in October 1793 was a farce. She was accused of depleting the treasury, conspiring with enemies, and, most horrifically, of sexually abusing her own son. She answered with dignity so piercing, even her enemies were shaken. "I appeal to all mothers here present," she said, when asked about the incest charge. The courtroom fell silent. On October 16, 1793, at 12:15 p.m., she stepped into the cart that would carry her to the Place de la Révolution. She wore a simple white dress, her hair cut short like a criminal's. She stumbled on the scaffold steps and apologized to the executioner for stepping on his foot. "Pardon me, sir," she said. "I did not do it on purpose." Those were her last words. But here's what history rarely tells you. In her final hours, she wrote a letter, not to her enemies, not to the world, but to her sister-in-law, Madame Elizabeth. In it, she forgave those who condemned her. She asked only that her children remember her as a mother who loved them. That letter was never delivered. It was confiscated, sealed away, and forgotten for over a century. So was Marie Antoinette guilty? Of vanity? Perhaps. Of poor judgment? Undoubtedly. But of treason, cruelty, or indifference to suffering? The evidence says no. She was a product of her time, a teenager thrust into a role she wasn't trained for, judged by standards that didn't exist when she was raised, and sacrificed to fuel a revolution that needed a face for its fury. And yet, her legacy endures, not as a warning against excess, but as a reminder that behind every caricature there is a human being. Frightened, flawed, and fighting to be understood. But the story doesn't end with her death. Because while Marie Antoinette was facing her final morning in a Paris prison, a secret plan was already in motion, one that would determine whether the royal bloodline survived or vanished forever. It was the plan that could have changed everything. A moonless night, a disguised royal family, a secret route through the heart of France, one carriage racing toward freedom, and perhaps the salvation of the monarchy itself. But in the end, it wasn't betrayal that doomed them. It wasn't bad luck. It was a face. A single ordinary face recognized in a quiet town at dawn that turned a desperate gamble into a national humiliation and sealed the fate of a king. This is the true story of the flight to Varennes, the boldest, most heartbreaking escape attempt in the history of the French Revolution. Not a tale of cowardice, as the revolutionaries claimed, but of a family clinging to the last thread of hope in a world that no longer wanted them. By the spring of 1791, Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette were prisoners in all but name. The revolution had stripped them of real power, yet kept them on display in the Tuileries Palace like relics in a museum of fallen glory. Every move they made was watched. Every word they spoke was reported. Even their meals were inspected for hidden messages. The king, once believed to rule by divine right, now needed permission to walk his dog. But inside those gilded walls, a quiet resistance stirred. Secretly, Louis had grown convinced that the only way to restore order and prevent civil war was to reach the eastern frontier, where royalist troops and foreign allies awaited. From there, he could negotiate as a sovereign, not a puppet. The idea was dangerous, treasonous in the eyes of the National Assembly. But to the royal family, it was not betrayal. It was survival. The mastermind behind the escape was not the king, but a Swedish nobleman named Count Axel von Fersen, a man whose loyalty to Marie Antoinette bordered on obsession. Some whispered of a secret romance. Others saw only chivalry. Whatever the truth, Fersen risked everything. He designed the route, secured false passports, and commissioned a custom-built berline, a massive, luxurious carriage disguised as a merchant's vehicle. It could carry 8 passengers, had hidden compartments, and was built for speed, not comfort. The plan was audacious. On the night of June 20th, 1791, the royal family would slip from the Tuileries through a hidden door, avoid guards by timing their exit between patrols, and meet Fersen at a nearby street. Then came the departure. Midnight struck. The Queen, dressed as a Russian baroness, guided her children through silent corridors. The Dauphin, just 6 years old, was disguised as a girl. The king wore a wig and plain coat, his massive frame trying to look inconspicuous. They made it out of the palace, miraculously, without raising alarm. But the carriage was late. Fersen, driving it himself at first, had to abandon it outside Paris to avoid suspicion. By the time they began their journey in earnest, precious hours were lost, and every delay brought them closer to detection. At first, the roads were quiet. Villagers bowed as the grand carriage passed, assuming its occupants were nobles, still a common sight, even in revolutionary France. But as they neared Saint-Ménehould, fate intervened in the form of a man named Jean-Baptiste Drouet. Drouet was a local postmaster and a fervent revolutionary. He had seen engravings of the king in newspapers. And though Louis wore spectacles and a floppy hat, something about his profile struck Drouet as familiar. Later, as the carriage stopped to change horses in Varennes, Drouet compared the passenger to a coin in his pocket, the louis d'or, bearing the king's profile. The resemblance was undeniable. While the royals rested inside an inn, believing they were safe, Drouet and a friend mounted horses and raced ahead. They sounded the alarm in Varennes before the royal carriage even arrived. By the time Louis stepped down to stretch his legs, the town was awake. Doors slammed shut, windows filled with faces. The local National Guard, once loyal to the crown, now blocked the bridge out of town. The king asked to speak. He appealed to their patriotism, their faith, their memory of his coronation. For a moment, silence fell. Then a voice from the crowd. "You are no longer our king." They were trapped. What followed was not violence, but humiliation. The family was confined to a cramped room above the inn. Messengers raced to Paris. Within 24 hours, a detachment of the National Guard arrived, not to rescue them, but to return them to captivity. The journey back was a slow-motion funeral march. Crowds lined the roads, not with cheers, but with silence. Some wept, others spat. Most just stared, as if witnessing the death of an idea. When they re-entered Paris on June 25th, the city was draped in black. The assembly debated whether to restore the king or abolish the monarchy entirely. Public opinion had turned decisively. "A king who flees his people has no right to rule them," declared one deputy. The notion of a constitutional monarchy, already fragile, now seemed like a fantasy. Worse, the escape attempt exposed the royal family's secret correspondence with Austria and Prussia, confirming revolutionary fears of foreign invasion. War loomed, and in that atmosphere of paranoia, moderates lost ground to radicals like Robespierre and Marat, who now argued, if the king cannot be trusted, perhaps the king should not exist at all. The flight to Varennes did not cause the revolution, but it destroyed any chance of reconciliation. It proved that Louis XVI could not accept the new France, and in doing so, it made his execution not just possible, but inevitable. Yet history often misses the human truth beneath the politics. This was not just a failed political maneuver, it was a family's last attempt to protect their children, to preserve their faith, to reclaim some shred of dignity. In the carriage, Marie Antoinette held her daughter's hand. The king read psalms aloud. The little Dauphin asked when they would see their garden again. They weren't conspirators in that moment. They were parents, afraid, tired, and utterly alone. And when they returned to Paris, they knew, deep in their bones, that they would never be free again. The Dauphin, the future Louis XVII, was fading, and with him, the last hope of the Bourbon dynasty. In the heart of revolutionary Paris, in a courtroom once used for royal weddings, a new kind of justice was born. It had no mercy, no appeals, no presumption of innocence. only verdicts and the road to the scaffold. The Revolutionary Tribunal was meant to protect the Republic from its enemies. But very soon, it became the Republic's greatest enemy of all. Was it justice, or was it vengeance dressed in legal robes? Did it defend liberty or devour it? This is the story of the court that tried a king, condemned a queen, and sentenced over 2,600 people to death in just 2 years, not because they were proven guilty, but because they were suspected of thinking the wrong thoughts. When the monarchy fell in August 1792, France didn't just lose a king, it lost its legal anchor. For centuries, justice had flowed from the crown. Now, with no monarch, no parliament, and no stable constitution, the nation teetered on chaos. Foreign armies marched on the borders, royalist uprisings flared in the provinces, and inside Paris, suspicion festered like a fever. Who could be trusted? Who was a friend of the people? And who was a secret monarchist, a traitor, an enemy of liberty? Out of this panic, the National Convention created the Revolutionary Tribunal on March 10, 1793. Its mission was clear: to swiftly punish those who threatened the revolution. At first, it targeted obvious figures: former ministers, émigré nobles, priests who refused to swear loyalty to the state. But as fear grew, so did the list of crimes. Merely expressing doubt about the government became counter-revolutionary sentiment. Wearing fine clothes? Suspicious. Not attending revolutionary festivals? Dangerous. Having foreign relatives? Treasonous. The court had 3 parts: a public prosecutor, first Antoine Fouquier-Tinville, a jury chosen from Parisian sections, and judges appointed by the convention. Trials lasted hours, sometimes minutes. Defense lawyers were allowed, but speaking too passionately could get you arrested too. Evidence? Often rumors, anonymous letters, or moral certainty. As one judge reportedly said, "When the people accuse, the accused is guilty." Louis XVI was its first great test. His trial began on December 10, 1792, not as a king, but as Citizen Louis Capet, stripped of his title, his history, even his name. The charge? Treason. Specifically, that he had conspired with foreign powers to crush the revolution and restore absolute monarchy. For 20 days, the convention debated. Some argued for exile, others for life imprisonment. But the radicals, led by Robespierre and Saint-Just, insisted, Louis must die so that the Republic may live. They framed the execution not as punishment, but as necessity, a surgical cut to remove the cancer of monarchy from the body politic. On January 15, 1793, 693 deputies voted. 361 declared him guilty of treason. 334 voted for immediate execution. By a margin of just 1 vote, Louis XVI was sentenced to death. His final days were quiet. He read scripture, played with his son, wrote letters he knew would be censored. On the morning of January 21st, he walked to the scaffold in thick snow, wearing a red shirt, the color of traitors. His last words were drowned out by drum rolls ordered to prevent any martyr's speech. The blade fell, and with it, the illusion that the revolution could be both merciful and just. But the tribunal had only just begun. Marie Antoinette followed 9 months later. Her trial was even more theatrical. Accused of depleting the treasury, conspiring with Austria, and, most shockingly, of sexually abusing her 8-year-old son, she faced a courtroom designed to humiliate, not judge. When the incest charge was read, she turned to the jury and said, "I appeal to all mothers present." The room fell silent. Even hardened revolutionaries looked away. She was found guilty in under 20 hours, executed on October 16, 1793. Yet the tribunal's net kept widening. Soon, it wasn't just aristocrats who fell, it was revolutionaries themselves. In the end, the tribunal consumed its own creators. Between April 1793 and May 1795, it issued over 2,600 death sentences in Paris alone, though some estimates, including regional tribunals, place the total during the Reign of Terror closer to 17,000 official executions, with tens of thousands more dying in prison or summary killings. Victims included nuns, shopkeepers, scientists, poets, and even children as young as 14. The law that enabled it, the Law of 22 Prairial, June 10, 1794, removed the right to counsel, banned witnesses for the defense, and declared that the only possible verdicts were acquittal or death. In its first 6 weeks, it produced over 1,300 executions, more than the previous 14 months combined. This was not justice. This was arithmetic of fear. And yet, the tribunal was not created by monsters. Many of its founders believed they were saving civilization. France was at war with Austria, Prussia, Britain, Spain, and the Netherlands. Cities like Lyon and Toulon had rebelled. Counter-revolutionaries plotted in shadows. In their minds, leniency was betrayal. Mercy was weakness. And in a time of existential crisis, they chose survival over principle. But history asks, at what point does defense become destruction? When does protecting a revolution justify betraying its ideals? The tribunal claimed to uphold liberté, égalité, fraternité, yet it created a system where one's life depended on political fashion, neighborhood gossip, or the mood of a prosecutor. It replaced the king's arbitrary power with the people's arbitrary wrath, proving that tyranny can wear many masks. And perhaps its greatest irony? The very men who built it to protect the republic ended up proving its fragility. For if liberty must be defended by silencing dissent, by executing opponents, by fearing thought itself, then what is left to defend? The tribunal was abolished in 1795, after the fall of Robespierre and the end of the Terror. Fouquier-Tinville, its chief prosecutor, was tried and executed, not for following orders, but for perverting justice. The new government, exhausted by bloodshed, sought stability, not purity. But the shadow of the tribunal never left. It became a warning, etched into every democratic constitution since, that emergency powers, once granted, are rarely surrendered. That fear is the enemy of fairness, and that no cause, however noble, justifies the abandonment of due process. Today, historians still debate. Was the tribunal necessary? Some say yes, that without it, France would have collapsed into civil war or foreign occupation. Others say no, that it poisoned the revolution from within, turning liberation into paranoia. But one truth remains undeniable. In the name of the people, the tribunal forgot the person. And in that forgetting, it lost the very soul it claimed to defend. But while the courtroom fell silent, another tragedy unfolded in a cold tower just blocks away, where a child, once hailed as the future Louis XVI, wasted away in chains, forgotten by the world, his fate hidden behind stone walls and sealed records. Who was this boy? Did he die in prison or escape to live in secret exile? And why did dozens of men, across Europe and America, spend lifetimes claiming to be him. It was meant to be an act of mercy. A machine so precise, so swift, so egalitarian, that death itself would become humane. But in the hands of revolution, the guillotine became something else entirely. The machine was built by German engineer Tobias Schmidt and tested on sheep, then corpses. When it worked, clean, fast, nearly painless, it was hailed as progress. Officially named the Louisette at first, after surgeon Antoine Louis, it soon became known by the name its creator never wanted, la guillotine. Ironically, Dr. Guillotin opposed the death penalty altogether. He never imagined his name would become synonymous with state-sanctioned killing. He spent the rest of his life trying to distance himself from it. But by 1792, the revolution had other plans. When Louis XVI was sentenced to death, the Assembly faced a dilemma: how to execute a king without making him a martyr. Traditional beheading by sword might feel too noble, hanging too vulgar. The guillotine offered the perfect solution: impersonal, mechanical, and, crucially, equal. A king would die the same way a baker or a thief would. No privilege, no ceremony, just the law. On January 21st, 1793, in the Place de la Révolution, now Place de la Concorde, Louis Capet placed his head in the lunette, the curved wooden frame, and the blade fell in a fraction of a second. The crowd, tens of thousands strong, fell silent, then erupted, not in celebration, but in stunned awe. Something ancient had just ended. Something terrifyingly modern had begun. The guillotine was no longer just a machine. It was a message. Over the next 2 years, it would claim more than 2,600 lives in Paris alone. But its power wasn't in the number. It was in the spectacle. Executions were held in broad daylight, often after festive processions. Vendors sold programs listing the condemned. Artists sketched portraits moments before death. Citizens brought children to see justice done. The scaffold became a civic theater, where loyalty to the Republic was reaffirmed with every drop of the blade. And yet, something unexpected happened. Instead of erasing the individuals, the guillotine immortalized them. Marie Antoinette, stepping onto the scaffold with dignity, became a symbol of grace under persecution. Charlotte Corday, who assassinated radical journalist Marat and faced death calmly, was painted as both monster and heroine. The Girondin leaders, singing the Marseillaise as they mounted the steps, turned their deaths into political performance. Even ordinary citizens, like the seamstress who mended the tricolor flag before her execution, were remembered not as criminals, but as victims of a system that confused suspicion with guilt. In death, they gained what they lacked in life: meaning. This is the birth of modern martyrdom, not rooted in faith, but in ideology. Unlike Christian martyrs who died for God, these martyrs died for ideas: liberty, monarchy, reason, or resistance. And because the revolution recorded everything — trials, last words, letters, even hair clippings — these deaths were preserved, studied, and sanctified. The guillotine didn't just kill bodies. It created legends. But the machine's greatest irony? It failed to make death anonymous. Long after the last blade fell, that question echoed through the 20th century, in Russia, in Germany, in Cambodia, in Chile. The tools changed, the ideologies shifted, but the logic remained chillingly familiar. Purity requires sacrifice. Progress requires elimination. The guillotine is gone. But the temptation it represents? That remains. Yet amid all this darkness, one story stands apart, not of death, but of vanishing. For while thousands died publicly on the scaffold, one royal child disappeared silently into the walls of a Paris prison. No trial, no last words, no body, just silence. And from that silence, 100 impostors would rise, each claiming to be the lost son of Louis XVI, the boy who should have been king. History remembers the king who lost his head. It remembers the queen who faced the scaffold with grace. But it often forgets the two children left behind, trapped in a cold tower, watched by armed guards, their names erased, their childhood stolen. They were not soldiers, not conspirators, not even old enough to understand what a republic was. Yet they became the revolution's most tragic prisoners. This is not a story of politics. It is a story of innocence held hostage by ideology. When Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette were taken from the Tuileries Palace in August 1792, they did not go alone. With them came their two surviving children. Marie-Thérèse Charlotte, aged 11, bright, observant, already scarred by years of public hatred. And Louis Charles, just 7 years old, the Dauphin, heir to a throne that no longer existed. At first, they were confined together in the Temple, a medieval fortress turned royal prison in the heart of Paris. The family shared 2 rooms, allowed books, simple meals, and daily walks on the roof under guard. For a few months, it was grim but bearable. They were still a family, still human. But everything changed on January 21st, 1793, the day the king was executed. From that moment, the revolution no longer saw them as a family. It saw them as symbols. And symbols in times of terror must be broken. Louis Charles, now technically Louis XVI in royalist eyes, was especially dangerous. As long as he lived, monarchists had a living claim to the throne. So the Committee of Public Safety made a chilling decision: separate the children from their mother. On July 3, 1793, guards entered the temple and took the young prince from Marie Antoinette's arms. She collapsed in tears, begging to keep him just one more night. The guards refused. The boy, confused and trembling, was led away to a small, dark room on the floor above, alone. Marie Antoinette never saw him again. What followed was one of the most harrowing episodes in the history of political imprisonment. Louis Charles was placed under the care of a cobbler named Antoine Simon and his wife, appointed by the Paris Commune as his official guardians. Their orders? To re-educate the boy, to strip him of royal pride, to make him a sans-culotte, a true child of the people. But re-education quickly became neglect, and worse. Contemporary accounts, including testimony from guards and servants, describe a child left in filthy clothes, fed stale bread and wine, forced to sing revolutionary songs, and punished for speaking of his parents. He was isolated for weeks at a time, denied fresh air, denied medical care. Some reports, later repeated at his mother's trial, claimed he was encouraged to make shocking accusations against her, possibly under coercion. Whether physical abuse occurred remains debated by historians, but psychological trauma is undeniable. The once lively boy grew pale, withdrawn, and ill. By 1794, he was suffering from what doctors described as scrofula, likely tuberculosis or severe lymphatic infection. After her death, only Marie-Thérèse remained with the boy for a short time. But in May 1794, She too was separated from him. Now, Louis Charles was truly alone. No family, no friends, not even a name. Official documents referred to him only as the prisoner in the temple. He spent his final years in a single room, windows nailed shut, door double-locked. Visitors were forbidden. Even his jailers rarely entered. He was a ghost in a stone box, kept alive not out of mercy, but because his death would spark royalist uprisings. On June 8, 1795, at just 10 years old, Louis Charles died. The cause, chronic illness, likely worsened by malnutrition and despair. The authorities announced his death quickly. A doctor performed an autopsy, claiming the boy's heart, removed and preserved in alcohol, showed signs of long-term disease. The body was buried in a mass grave near the temple. No funeral, no marker, just silence. But the story didn't end there. Because how could a kingdom mourn a king it never crowned? How could a nation accept that the future had died in a cellar? Almost immediately, rumors spread. He escaped. The body was a decoy. The real Dauphin is alive. Over the next century, more than 60 men across Europe and America claimed to be Louis XVI. Some were delusional. Others were con artists. A few, like the German clockmaker Naundorf, gained devoted followers, even royal recognition from distant cousins. DNA testing in the early 2000s finally confirmed the truth. The heart preserved in 2004 matched Marie Antoinette's descendants. The boy in the temple was real, and he died there. But the myth endured, because the truth was too painful to accept. A child should not die for politics. Yet he did. His sister, Marie-Thérèse, was the only royal child to survive. After 3 years and 4 months of imprisonment, longer than any of her family, she was released in December 1795, exchanged for French prisoners of war. She was 17, pale and silent. When she crossed the border into Austria, she never once looked back at France. She later married her cousin, the Duke of Angoulême, and spent her life advocating for royalist causes, but always with a quiet sorrow. She never had children. In her memoirs, she wrote only briefly of the temple, saying, "I do not speak of what I cannot bear to remember." Her survival was a miracle. But it came at the cost of everything she loved. The fate of the royal children forces us to ask difficult questions. What happens when ideology targets the innocent? When a revolution, in its quest for purity, turns on the most vulnerable? Louis Charles was not executed by the guillotine, but he was killed by the same force that drove the blade. The belief that some lives must be sacrificed for a new world. And Marie-Thérèse, she lived, but carried the temple inside her forever. Their story is a reminder that history is not just made by kings and generals. It is also shaped by those who suffer in silence, by children who never got to grow up, by mothers who died not knowing if their sons were safe. The revolution claimed to fight for the future. When the blade fell on January 21, 1793, it wasn't just Louis Capet who perished. It was the 1,000-year-old idea that kings ruled by divine right, that power flowed from God through bloodlines, not from the consent of the governed. That belief had shaped Europe since Charlemagne, and in one afternoon, it collapsed. But the revolution didn't just kill a king. It gave the world a new political language. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, drafted in 1789, declared that liberty, property, security, and resistance to oppression were natural rights, that all citizens are equal before the law. that sovereignty resides in the nation, not the crown. These ideas seem obvious today, but in the 18th century, they were revolutionary, literally. And though the revolution descended into terror, those ideals survived. They crossed oceans, inspired constitutions, fueled rebellions. In Haiti, enslaved people rose up in 1791, shouting the same slogans heard in Paris. Liberté, égalité. By 1804, they had created the first Black Republic in history, born from the same fire that consumed Louis XVI. In Latin America, Simón Bolívar studied the French Revolution as he dreamed of freeing a continent. He called it the dawn of a new age. The constitutions of Venezuela, Colombia, and Mexico all echoed the rights of man. Even in the United States, a nation already independent, the French Revolution forced a national debate. Jefferson saw it as the glorious sequel to 1776. Adams feared its chaos, but both agreed on one thing: the world had changed. Monarchy was no longer inevitable. Republics were possible. And in Europe, kings trembled. Censorship tightened. Reformers went underground. But the seed had been planted. By 1848, revolutions erupted from Berlin to Budapest, all demanding what the French had first dared to name: popular sovereignty, universal rights, and accountable government. Louis XVI never intended any of this. He wanted to be a good king, not the last king. But in failing to adapt, he became the ultimate lesson. When leaders ignore the people will rewrite the rules. Yet the revolution also left a warning. The same assembly that proclaimed liberty sent thousands to the guillotine. The same republic that banned tyranny created its own terror. The same citizens who demanded equality turned on their neighbors over suspicion. This is the paradox at the heart of modern democracy. Freedom requires limits. Justice requires due process. Revolution without restraint becomes its own oppression. The fall of Louis XVI taught the world that power must be answerable. But it also showed how easily the cry for justice can become a scream for blood. That's why the 19th and 20th centuries were filled with revolutions that began in hope and ended in dictatorship. They remembered the king's fall, but forgot the queen's trial. They embraced the rights of man, but abandoned the rule of law. True democracy, it turns out, isn't just about removing tyrants. It's about building institutions strong enough to protect the innocent, even when fear is high, even when enemies are real. Today, that lesson echoes louder than ever. In courtrooms, in parliaments, in classrooms, in protests from Alabama to Afghanistan, people still ask, who has the right to rule? What makes a law just? If this journey through the fall of a king and the rise of a new world moved you, if you believe that history isn't just dates and dead people, but living questions that shape our lives today, then you belong here. We're not just making videos. We're uncovering the hidden why behind the world, from the streets of Paris to the small towns of Alabama. Why is your city named what it is? Why did a law change? Why did someone stand up or stay silent? Every week, we dive deep into stories that textbooks skip. Stories of real people, real choices, and real consequences. And we bring them to you with clear storytelling, bold visuals, and respect for the truth. So hit that subscribe button and tap the bell so you never miss any history video like this. Join our growing community of curious minds who believe that understanding the past is the key to building a better future. And if you're from Alabama or anywhere in the South, you'll find stories here that honor your roots while exploring the wider world, because every place has a history worth telling. Yours included? Thank you for watching. For thinking.
For caring.
This isn't the end. It's just the beginning of your next question. Stay curious, stay bold, and see you in the next video.